When I got the frantic call that my wife was being dragged, literally dragged, out of her mother's wake by HOA security, I thought I misheard. Until I showed up and saw her sobbing on the sidewalk, funeral dress torn, mascara running. I asked who gave the order. A smug woman in heels pointed at herself and said, "I did. HOA rules are rules." Shame she didn't recognize me, because I'm the state attorney general. And I don't forget things like this. It's not every day you witness your wife being manhandled off her own dead mother's lawn like a trespasser, but that's exactly where I found myself on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon in Maple Ridge Estates. The wake was supposed to be a quiet, respectful send-off. Just family and close friends. Some sandwiches. A few chairs under a canopy in the front yard. Nothing outrageous. Nothing disruptive. Unless, apparently, you're Marlene Buckley, Supreme Ruler of the Homeowners Association, who saw a grieving woman honoring her mother's memory as a Class C violation of Section 7B, unapproved gatherings. My wife, Sarah, was still in shock. She'd been numb for days since her mother passed. This wake was the one thing grounding her, the one chance she had to say goodbye properly. And this woman, this manicured, clipboard-wielding tyrant, turned it into a power trip. I crouched beside Sarah on the sidewalk, pulled her into my arms, and gently smoothed her hair. She clung to me like a lifeline, crying so hard her whole body shook. The sheer humiliation of being ejected from her childhood home during her mother's funeral was seared into her expression. I stood up slowly, measured, already switching gears in my head. I didn't yell. Didn't make a scene. I looked Marlene right in her Botoxed face and asked, with clinical calm, "Who authorized this?" She didn't hesitate. Just jutted her chin out, pointed to herself like she was unveiling a masterpiece, and said, "I did. HOA rules are rules." Oh honey. Sarah and I got in the car. I drove her home, quietly listening as she cried the whole ride. I didn't try to explain it or fix it in the moment. I just held her hand, made her tea when we got back, and helped her out of her torn dress. After she finally fell asleep, exhausted, broken, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, laptop open. Not for work. For war. Let me back up a bit. Sarah's mom, Eloise, had moved into Maple Ridge Estates 4 years ago. She was a sweet, old-fashioned woman who loved gardening, potlucks, and neighborhood gossip. She moved in before the HOA got aggressive. Before Marlene Buckley made it her personal kingdom. When Eloise got sick, Sarah and I spent a lot of time at that house. We trimmed her hedges. We took her to appointments. We were good neighbors. We followed the rules. But even then, Marlene found a way to be awful. First, it was the garbage bins. Eloise left hers out 5 minutes past pickup and got a fine. Then it was the color of her mailbox. Not approved earth tones, apparently. We once got a written warning for parking our car. Get this, 2 inches over the edge of the driveway. Marlene was the kind of person who walked around with a tape measure and a superiority complex. She lived for the petty stuff. It gave her life. The thing is, she never once asked what I did for a living. She just assumed. Khakis, button-down, clean car. I must be middle management at a paper company or something. She never connected the dots. Never realized that I'm the newly elected state attorney general. Which made this particular abuse of power more than just personal. It was jurisdictional. Now, I'm not one to throw my title around. I don't lead with it. But when someone weaponizes bylaws against a grieving widow, we're not talking about a neighborly dispute. We're talking about a line being crossed in neon red. And I don't take kindly to lines being crossed. So I started reading. Maple Ridge HOA bylaws. City zoning regulations. State statutes on private property governance. My screen glowed with tabs and PDFs, highlighter marks and legal note. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the first crack. Because HOAs? They love their rules, until someone actually knows what they mean. It didn't take long to find the first one. According to their own bylaws, any fine over $500 required a mediation process. There was no mediation. No hearing. Just a security guard, a clipboard, and my wife's trauma. Next, I noticed their enforcement clause was improperly structured. They had no documented authority to physically remove anyone from a private property, especially not family of the homeowner. And then, the real kicker, the HOA's security team wasn't licensed. No permit, no training. Just a couple of retired dudes in polos and earpieces. Meaning the moment they laid hands on Sarah, they opened the entire HOA up to civil liability. But I didn't move fast. No. I didn't send a cease and desist or go full prosecutor mode. That's not how you win against people like Marlene. She lives for confrontation. Lives for screaming matches at board meetings and dramatic emails with bold red text. What she doesn't expect is silence. Calm. Strategy. Bureaucratic precision. I didn't show up at the next HOA meeting. I let the Wake incident slide publicly. Let her think she won. That her petty little crusade had broken us. Meanwhile, I started laying groundwork. Quietly calling in a few favors. Requesting access to HOA filings. Cross-checking state compliance documents. Submitting an anonymous complaint to the state's Office of Property Association Oversight. By the end of the week, I had enough to make the entire HOA sweat. But I still wasn't ready to act. Because then Sarah got the letter. A fine. Hand-delivered by a board member, for violating community policy and hosting an unregistered event. The amount? $1,250. Due immediately. No mediation. No appeal. Sarah broke down again when she saw it. Thought maybe we'd done something wrong. That maybe she really had ruined something. And that's when I decided to stop playing defense. Marlene wanted to hide behind rules? I would bury her in them. But before I could file the first real motion, before I could tip the first domino, I got an unexpected visit. A knock at our front door. Late evening. I opened it to find one of Marlene's own board members, Dennis, the HOA treasurer, standing there, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. He glanced over his shoulder, lowered his voice, and said, "I think you should know. Something's not right with the books. And I think Marlene's covering it up." That's when I realized, this wasn't just going to be petty revenge. It was going to be something much, much bigger. Dennis didn't step inside right away. He hovered at the edge of the doorway like a man trying to decide if he was about to confess a sin or become an accomplice. I just raised an eyebrow and waited. I've learned something in my line of work. If you let silence hang long enough, the truth tends to fill it. Sure enough, Dennis glanced over his shoulder again and finally whispered, "I think Marlene's been skimming money. Beautification funds. It's not adding up." Then he rubbed his hands together nervously like he regretted even coming. I opened the door wider and motioned him in. He stepped over the threshold like it was lava and perched on the edge of the couch, still looking like he expected someone to kick the door in. Over the next 20 minutes, I got the basics. Dennis, the meekest member of the HOA board, had noticed discrepancies in the budget for months. New flower beds that cost $10,000, landscaping projects that were never actually completed, security upgrades that consisted of 2 walkie-talkies and a new sign. It didn't smell right. But every time he asked questions, Marlene shut him down. Told him it was above his pay grade, and if he kept making noise, he might find himself removed from the board for undermining leadership. It wasn't just the money, though. That's what made this visit so interesting. Dennis said something else that caught my attention. Apparently, Marlene had personally approved the use of physical removal by the so-called security volunteers. There was no board vote, no legal guidance, just a handwritten note authorizing them to enforce HOA compliance in real time. Translation: she told a couple of retired mall cops they could manhandle people for not filling out paperwork. That changed the game. I had gone into this expecting petty revenge. A legal slap on the wrist. Maybe some public embarrassment. But now? Now there were financial irregularities, potential embezzlement, unauthorized enforcement, and a board member who was scared enough to whisper it in my living room. That wasn't just a crack in the dam, it was the start of a collapse. I thanked Dennis for coming forward and assured him that no one would know he spoke to me. He looked relieved, but also terrified. As he left, he said something that stuck with me. She thinks she's untouchable because she's never been challenged. Just don't underestimate her. She fights dirty. That was cute. I fight with court subpoenas. The next morning, I got to work. First, I started collecting every document I could get my hands on. Public filings, tax documents, community financial statements. I pulled records from the Secretary of State's office to verify the HOA's incorporation status. They were, technically, a nonprofit entity. That meant state oversight, required reporting, and most importantly, accountability. I found missing quarterly reports, expenditures that didn't match receipt, contracts that were awarded without bids. Then I made a few calls. Not as the Attorney General, not yet. Just a concerned citizen asking hypothetical questions to colleagues who owed me favors. I spoke with the Office of the State HOA Oversight Board, dropped a few breadcrumbs, and got pointed toward the right forms. I spoke to a friend at a local news station and said, off the record, if a grieving widow was physically removed from her mother's wake by an HOA, would that make for a slow news day filler, or? Her response, send me the footage and we'll lead with it. So I did. See, what Marlene didn't know was that one of the guests at the wake had recorded the entire scene from across the street. It wasn't great quality, but it was enough. You could see Sarah, dressed in black, being pulled away from her family. You could hear her crying. You could hear the security guy saying, per Marlene's orders, you're in violation. And you could see Marlene herself, arms crossed like she was watching a dog being shooed off her lawn. I didn't upload the video myself. That would have made it traceable. I passed it through a burner account on a local neighborhood group. Captioned it, HOA removes grieving daughter from her own mother's funeral. Maple Ridge Estates. Within hours it was spreading. The comments section lit up. People were furious. How is this even legal? This is disgusting. These people have no soul. And then came the best part. Other residents from Maple Ridge chiming in with their own horror stories. That night, I sat beside Sarah on the couch and held her hand while she read through the comments. Her eyes were tired, but for the first time in days, there was a flicker of something else, vindication. She didn't say much, just leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." Meanwhile, Marlene remained blissfully unaware. Or at least, she thought the outrage would blow over. But it didn't. And I wasn't done. I filed a formal complaint with the State Office of Nonprofit Regulation. Attached financial irregularities, screenshots, and excerpts from the HOA's own bylaws. Then I submitted an anonymous tip to the Department of Consumer Protection about the use of unlicensed security personnel. A week later, I saw the first sign that the pressure was working. An emergency HOA meeting was called behind closed doors. No minutes were released. But according to a neighbor who overheard, Marlene was furious, screaming about witch hunts and personal vendettas. She was half right. Then came the letter, delivered to our mailbox with no return address. It was printed, unsigned, and reeked of fear. It said that continued antagonistic behavior toward the HOA may result in further sanctions. Sarah was shaken. I wasn't. I scanned it for language, tone, and phrasing. Legal posturing. Empty threats. But the fact they were scared enough to try intimidation meant I was winning. So I started turning the screws. I filed a public records request with the HOA board demanding financial transparency under state nonprofit disclosure laws. I gave them 30 days to comply. If they didn't, I'd have the legal right to escalate it to the Attorney General's office, which, funny enough, was me. Then I reached out to a local independent audit firm, asked them to look over the public records and give me a preliminary read. They found over $20,000 in miscategorized expenses. Landscaping work billed twice. equipment purchases from a company that didn't exist, and one particularly curious payment labeled consulting services that traced back to a relative of Marlene's. It was all lining up beautifully. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors, quiet guy named Mark, came by with a package. Said he found it on his doorstep with no name. Inside were photocopies of internal HOA emails, printed threads between board members. One from Marlene read, "He doesn't know who he's messing with. I don't care if his wife's mother died, rules are rules. If he keeps pushing, I'll find a way to evict them." She had no idea those words would be her undoing. Because I wasn't just building a case anymore. I was preparing to take down an empire. And Marlene, in all her arrogant glory, had just handed me the match. The only question now was how big a fire I wanted to start. The fire started with a knock at Marlene's door, but it wasn't me standing there. It was a courier from the office of the State Attorney General, hand-delivering a formal notice of pending legal investigation. The envelope was heavy stock, the kind that practically announces authority before it's even opened. Inside was a multi-page breakdown of the inquiry into Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, citing potential violations of state nonprofit statutes, misuse of HOA funds, failure to comply with financial disclosure laws, and the unauthorized engagement of unlicensed security personnel. To any ordinary person, it would read like a death sentence. To Marlene, I imagine it felt like betrayal from the universe itself. After all, who dares challenge the queen of the cul-de-sac? By the time I got wind of her reaction, she'd already called an emergency meeting with what was left of her fractured board. Dennis, the trembling treasurer, updated me that 2 members had resigned in the last week, one citing stress, the other citing creative differences. Translation: they smelled smoke and didn't want to go down with the house. That left Marlene, Dennis, and one other loyalist, a guy named Frank who once fined a neighbor for having a ceramic gnome in their yard. Not exactly an airtight defense team. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. The video of Sarah's wake had made its rounds through local news, and the comments weren't letting up. People who'd lived under the iron thumb of the HOA were suddenly emboldened. An anonymous Facebook group formed called Free Maple Ridge, where residents shared stories of fines for wind chimes, citations for slightly faded shutters, and Marlene's infamous seasonal decor crackdown. One woman had been threatened with legal action for putting up Halloween decorations before October. Another man had been written up for having a basketball hoop. Petty tyranny, all of it, and now it was unraveling in the most public way possible. I kept my distance, let the pressure build organically. I wasn't trying to be the hero, I just wanted justice served cold and properly plated. But it became impossible to stay invisible when the audit firm submitted its report. The numbers were worse than I expected. Over $30,000 in improperly tracked spending, multiple duplicate charges for security maintenance, and a series of checks written to a landscaping company that had no business license and, upon further investigation, no actual employees. The owner listed on the paperwork? Marlene's nephew. At that point, it was more than mismanagement. It was fraud. I had everything I needed. The evidence, the motive, the witness testimony. I could have brought the hammer down myself, opened the case from my own desk. But I wanted to make it cleaner. So I handed it off to a special counsel, a bulldog named Vera who doesn't smile and once sued a city council into oblivion for hiding traffic camera profit. Vera took one look at the paperwork and said, "Oh, we're going to have fun with this." The next week, subpoenas were issued. The HOA's bank records were requested. Marlene was officially named as the subject of a state-level investigation. And still, she didn't back down. She held another HOA meeting, this time with just Frank and 2 terrified homeowners who showed up for unrelated questions. She stood at the front of the clubhouse like a politician under siege and delivered a speech that could only be described as delusional. According to reports, she blamed radical forces, a personal vendetta, and outsiders who don't understand community values. Never once did she mention my name. But that didn't stop the knowing glances from the residents. By now, most of them had connected the dot. And I wasn't exactly hiding anymore. When I passed her on the sidewalk a few days later, walking Sarah to her mom's now empty house, she tried to pretend she didn't see me. But her lips tightened, her eyes narrowed, and I saw it, the crack in her armor. Not fear. Not yet. But panic was beginning to bloom. And then came the best part. I filed a motion for temporary injunction against the HOA, citing irreparable harm caused to residents through mismanagement, intimidation, and misuse of power. With the audit report in hand and public support rising, the court granted it. Effective immediately, all HOA enforcement activity was frozen. Fines suspended. Security disbanded. Marlene's little kingdom? Shut down by law. The flyer went out the next day. Black and white, plain font, no embellishment. The HOA is currently under state investigation. You are not obligated to pay any fines or fees until further notice. It was tacked to every mailbox and slipped under every door. You could almost hear the collective exhale of the neighborhood. For the first time in years, people felt like they could breathe. But I wasn't done. I had waited long enough. It was time for the reveal. The next HOA board meeting, technically still permitted under the injunction, was held in the community center. Packed house. People lined the walls. And for the first time, I showed up. I didn't speak right away. I sat in the back row, arms crossed, just watching as Marlene tried to open the meeting. Her voice shook as she read from a typed agenda. When she finally asked if there were any public comments, I stood. She saw me, and for a moment I thought she might run. But I walked to the front, pulled a printed packet from my folder, and set it on the podium. "My name is Nate Carter," I said, clearly and calmly. "Some of you know me. Some of you only know what's happened to my wife and me these last few weeks. But what most of you don't know is that I am also the state attorney general. And I've been watching this HOA violate laws, intimidate residents, and exploit grieving families long enough." The room went silent. You could hear someone inhale sharply in the back. Marlene opened her mouth, closed it again. She looked like a woman watching her world slide off a cliff. I continued, laying out the findings. The misuse of funds. The illegal fines. The unlicensed security. The intimidation letters. And then I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You had the audacity to have my wife dragged out of her mother's wake. You thought you could hide behind rules, behind process. But rules only protect people who follow them. You didn't follow them. And now, you're going to be held accountable." I left the packet on the table and walked out. I didn't need to stay. The seeds were planted. The machinery of justice was in motion. But later that night, as I poured a glass of scotch and watched Sarah finally smile again, I got a message from Dennis. "Marlene stepped down. Effective immediately. Said she's moving." I looked out the window toward the community center, lights still glowing dim in the distance. One more queen off the board. It was strange how quickly peace returned once the tyrant fled. One day there were laminated violation slips blowing through the cul-de-sac like autumn leaves, and the next there was just quiet. No more early morning HOA inspections, no more email blasts about decorative flags being 2 inches too wide, no more passive-aggressive warnings taped to mailboxes. Marlene had disappeared as suddenly as she had once seized power. Her house went dark. 4 sale signs showed up within the week. Some people said she moved in with family out of state. Others claimed she was staying with her nephew, the one whose fake landscaping company had been collecting HOA payments. I didn't particularly care where she ended up. As far as I was concerned, her chapter in our lives was closed. But the damage she left behind wasn't just financial or procedural. It was emotional. Sarah had spent weeks in a fog after her mother's death, and Marlene's actions had twisted that grief into something even more painful. But now, for the first time since that awful day, I saw light returning to her. Not all at once. It came slowly, like the way morning spills into a room through cracked blinds. Little things. She started tending to her mother's garden again. She sorted through old photo albums without breaking down. She sat on the porch with coffee and didn't flinch at the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. One afternoon, she asked me if it would be okay to host a small gathering at the house. Nothing big. Just a few family members and close friends who hadn't gotten the chance to say goodbye properly. Of course I said yes. She was nervous, still traumatized by what happened the first time. But this time there was no HOA. No fines. No threats. No patrols. Just neighbors showing up with casseroles, folding chairs, and quiet respect. I watched her move through the gathering, greeting people with soft hugs, offering tissues, even laughing gently when her cousin shared a silly memory about her mother's obsession with labeling Tupperware. It was healing, and it was long overdue. I stood off to the side with a drink in hand and realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. The fight had consumed me for weeks. Every motion I filed, every document I uncovered, every trap I laid, it had all been fueled by fury and a need for justice. But watching Sarah finally at peace made me realize what the fight had really been about. Not revenge. Not power. Just love. Love for someone who deserved to grieve without fear. That night, after the guests left and we cleaned up the last of the coffee cups and cake plates, Sarah sat on the couch beside me and said, "I think Mom would have been proud of how you handled all of this." I smiled, touched her cheek, and said, "She always liked me more than she let on." She laughed, for real this time. The sound filled the room like fresh air. The legal proceedings against the HOA board members continued quietly in the background. I stayed out of the spotlight as much as I could. Vera was more than capable of seeing it through, and besides, I didn't want this story to be about me. I wasn't interested in headlines. I was interested in accountability. A few weeks after Marlene's resignation, the court approved the HOA's dissolution under resident petition. 78% of the homeowners signed to disband it permanently. In its place, a simple neighborhood committee was formed. Informal. Voluntary. No fines, no overreach, no bylaws thicker than a phone book. Just people agreeing to be decent to each other. They asked me if I wanted to serve on it. I politely declined. I told them I preferred to stay in the background, maybe offer legal advice if needed, but otherwise, I'd rather mow my lawn without someone measuring it afterward. There was a final act to this saga, though, and it came unexpectedly. I was walking past Marlene's old house one afternoon, sipping coffee, when I noticed a moving truck outside. The new owners were unloading boxes, cheerful and relaxed. I introduced myself, and they welcomed me like we'd been neighbors for years. Said they were glad the place was quiet now. I nodded, smiled, and before I walked away, I handed them a small gift bag I'd been saving for just this moment. Inside was a copy of the state HOA Compliance Handbook, a neighborhood contact sheet, and a handwritten note that said, "Just in case." A little joke. A little reminder. A little insurance policy. That weekend, the new neighborhood bulletin board went up next to the mailboxes. No official logo. No HOA stamp. Just a wooden frame and a cork board, inviting messages and announcements. The first posting was from Sarah. It was a picture of her mother's garden, now fully blooming again, with a caption that read, "In memory of Eloise. Thank you to everyone who helped bring peace back to this place." It made me choke up a little, not that I'd admit it if you asked me in public. People started adding their own note. Kids selling lemonade. Lost cat sightings. A potluck invitation. It felt like a neighborhood again, not a regime. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a local conference on legal overreach by private entities. I declined. Told them I was taking time off to focus on my family. But I did send a one-sentence quote they could use if they wanted. Rules should protect people, not punish them. Sarah and I sat on the porch that evening, her head on my shoulder, the air warm and still. I looked out at the street where it had all started, where my wife had once been humiliated in the worst moment of her life. Now that same street was quiet, peaceful, and free. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need gloating or celebration. I had something better. I had closure. And just as I was about to head inside, I saw a car slow roll past the neighborhood, driver scanning the houses like they were remembering something. The window was tinted, but the silhouette looked familiar. Hair up in a tight bun. Shoulders stiff. The car didn't stop, just drove by, slowly, deliberately. I smiled. Maybe it was Marlene, maybe it wasn't. Either way, I wasn't worried. Because if she ever dared to come back, she wouldn't be facing just me. She'd be facing an entire neighborhood that had finally learned how to stand up for itself.